Thank you so much for coming today. Good afternoon. Happy TechEd Tuesday. Here we go. This is 0 to 60 developing apps for Microsoft SharePoint 2013. What we're going to be doing in this series, we had a series 0 to 60 developing apps for Office, and now we have another 0 to 60 developing apps for SharePoint. And the idea behind this particular session is to get you going as fast as possible by giving you some of the information, just the snippets, right? Things that you need, anything you need to actually get started, and just the basics. We'll actually walk you through how to build an app. We'll build apps. We'll show you examples of what some of these apps are. We'll show you some examples of some of the APIs, and we'll walk you through what it takes to actually build some of these SharePoint apps. My name is Israel Vega, and I'm with ThinkBot Consulting, and joining me on stage is Nathan Miller. Nathan Miller's with Microsoft. The objectives, again, we're going to show you the application model, right? What is the idea behind SharePoint apps? Why SharePoint apps? We'll talk about the different hosting options. Where can I actually host my SharePoint app? Where can I put it? Do I have to put it on SharePoint? Can I actually put it somewhere else? We'll talk about the different solutions and building. How do I build them? What tools do I use? How do I get started? Permissions and security, we'll walk through that, and we'll also talk about deployment and management. I will touch very briefly on management, like what do I actually do when I'm using these apps in my organization? How can I actually work with these? Just to get a quick level set of how we're trying to break up the talk, we have some IT Pro content, we have some dev content, we have some HTML regular developer content, and some SharePoint content. So we're going to try to keep everybody happy in the audience, because we're thinking we have a mixed audience, right? We've got some new folks, we've got some folks that are IT pros, we have some folks that are developers, and some folks that are just regular SharePoint developers, if there's such a thing as a regular SharePoint developer.
And one of the other things that we try to do is a lot of questions that we get when we talk to customers or when we do events like this, there's some common misconceptions, so we're trying to touch on some of those points. That way, if developers come to you, or if you're kind of working in that environment, you kind of know what things to be looking for in doing this new 2013 types of apps.
All right, so why, right? Why is Microsoft changing direction, and why are they building apps? We used to be, if you're a former SharePoint developer, I shouldn't call you a former SharePoint developer. If you are a SharePoint developer today, you were used to building strongly typed apps. You're used to building, C# and full trust solutions. You may have built some sandbox solutions. So what's changing, right? What's the new thing behind this app model? Well, the market is definitely changing. There are more than 700,000 SharePoint developers. Today's trends are moving towards HTML5, CSS3, JavaScript, moving more towards client-side rendering and client-side business logic as opposed to server-side rendering logic. 75% of developers that are out there today are using HTML5. So when you look at this slide, really what we're trying to do is show you that the landscape for applications is changing. And the SharePoint product group had to change with it. And this is what they've come up with as far as the platform for building it. And we think they've done a pretty good job. They've done a pretty good job kind of abstracting it. We'll walk you through what exactly that is. The other one that is really important is that bottom one there, give choice for developers. We realize that not everybody is building on the same type of platform, right? People are using different devices, people are using different platforms. So we wanted to give the opportunity, legacy applications, we wanted to give them an opportunity to actually play in SharePoint land. And SharePoint land is pretty big. The result of the guidance and some of the research that they've done is a new cloud app model. And with the new app model, what we're doing is we're not installing things onto SharePoint, we're installing things next to SharePoint. You're running them alongside of SharePoint. And what SharePoint knows about is just really a starter page. Where do I actually go to run my app? And when I go to delete something, it's not something where I'm ripping application functionality completely out of my site. It's something that's running right alongside. So if you've worked with, the example that we always use when we're explaining apps, the Facebook, if you've installed Mafia Wars, if you've installed any of the other apps that are on Facebook, you notice that when you actually run those apps, you install them onto your Facebook profile, they get access to some of your information, but the actual running guts of that application is running somewhere else. Similar model. We're going to go and put something into SharePoint, tell SharePoint, hey, this is where I want you to start the app, and here's what I want you to do, and give you flexibility around actually managing that application lifecycle. Again, we'll show you the different things there. The other thing we wanted to have is familiar tool sets. People are using Dreamweaver, Notepad, Visual Studio. We also have a web UI for building these things. And we recognize that. So we want to make sure that developers are using the tools that they're comfortable with to actually build these applications. So let's show you what this looks like.
Seven.
Show you some examples. What I have here is the apps for Office and SharePoint. So if you go to dev.office.com, this is how you get started building apps. You get yourself a developer tenant. So here, when it comes to apps for SharePoint, you click there. This will give you information all about building apps, some cool videos, other information around the APIs. The big blue button here where it says Start, we had some questions on this earlier. If you have an existing Office 365 developer tenant, you're going to click on this one, and it's going to tell you, hey, it's already pre-configured. You just go ahead and create a developer tenant. If you're brand new and you haven't done this before, you're going to go ahead and click on sign up for an Office 365 developer site. Try it for free. You go through, you get a trial, and when you get that trial, you get Link, you get Exchange, you get SharePoint, you get access to Napa, which I'll show you in a second, which is for building tools or building SharePoint apps, and that's how you get started pretty quick.
And the nice thing, so if you have MSDN, you notice that the redeem your benefit here. This subscription actually comes with MSDN as well. So you've got Azure with your MSDN, plus you've got the Office 365. What's great about that is that it has hosted Exchange, it has hosted SharePoint, and it has the Office client. So you really have all the tools that you need to build each type of Office app or each type of SharePoint app. And even if the data is coming on-premise, it really doesn't matter. You can actually use this framework to test your applications in.
Absolutely. So what you get when you have a developer tenant, in this case here, we already have one pre-provisioned. I have some apps here, just a list that says what my app's in testing. We'll show you what it looks like to actually go out and add an app. We'll click on Site Contents. When we go to Site Contents, you'll see this thing called Add an App. Now, one thing that they changed, if you're familiar with SharePoint and you're brand new to SharePoint 2013, one thing that you'll notice that's a little bit different is that they're trying to change the vocabulary around how they talk to end users. So in this case here, we're plugging things into SharePoint. It used to be that you would have an add new something, right? Add new list, add new document library. What they're trying to do is change the vocabulary, change the paradigm for the end users. Everything is an app. Even though behind the scenes, if you're a SharePoint person, you realize, no, this is a document library. Start changing your mentality a little bit. This is an app. This is something that I'm plugging into SharePoint and using. So here, when I click Add an App, I can see apps that are already on my site, but I see a couple things that are also interesting. I get From My Organization. I don't have anything in this, but I'll show you what the app catalog is, and I'll show you how to get stuff in there for your tenant. So we'll show you that. This is a place where you could, as an organization, build apps, deploy apps just for your tenancy, just for your organization. This is also available for you on-prem. So you can actually deploy apps on-premise for your organization and deploy them within your company, within your SharePoint environment. The other thing we have is the SharePoint Store. SharePoint Store is a marketplace. So for the developers in the room that are not working for customers every day, or not working at a company every day, and they want to build apps to actually make some money, the SharePoint Store is a great place for you to build apps and get access to all of those SharePoint implementations that are out there. So here we want to show you how quickly it is to add an app. We will not be doing the Flaming Beaver CSV upload. We'll try, I think I already have corporate news. We'll try Anniversary Timeline. We'll go through there. We'll click Add an App. Add it. What it's doing is it's going to go through a purchase process. In this case here, it's free. Actually, did I click on a free one? Let's go back here. One second, just try this again. All right, let's try document shared with me. That one's free. Add it. I'll show you how simple it is. Oh, it's still asking me for it. Give me one sec. All right, so I'm going to go and authenticate, confirm that I wish to add the app, click the button. It's going to ask me a question. It's going to go ahead and get the details of that app. It's going to allow me to check a box and say, hey, do you want to add this to your team site? Yes, I do.
Yeah, go ahead.
And here it's going to ask me, do I trust this app? We'll talk about the permissions model and how these app permissions actually work. In this case here, this app is going to do a few things. It is going to ask to execute search queries on my behalf, and it's going to ask to ignore the application the app permissions on the result item. So this app needs to go out and find some items and actually pull items back. In this case here, I trust this application for my developer tenant. I'm going to go ahead and trust it. And it's installing. Now, pretty quick, right? Usually you have to get a WSP, you have to build some stuff, you have to deploy it, you have to work with 5 or 6 different groups within the organization to actually move the app from dev to test to prod. So this was pretty difficult before. Now we're just installing the app, and now we have an app. Pretty cool. Yep. I'll go back here to site contents, add an app, and I want to show you something. For the IT pros in the organization where they're thinking, wow, I don't want it to be that easy. I want to be able to maybe control the apps. I don't want to give my end users access to the marketplace. Or I want to provide them access, but I want to have some type of process where they ask for an application and then I approve that request. There's a thing called your request. Now here, if I had a request and I had this enabled, we'll show you where to enable this in a second. I can actually request an application as an end user, request that an application get installed. The request can get approved by an administrator, and then the application could get installed on my team site. So it's not just kind of this willy-nilly model. What they've done is they've thought about what organizations need, how organizations are going to be plugging things into SharePoint, and they've thought about the governance process behind that. I'll go over to my tenant, admin, and here the way I got to that was my admin SharePoint. And here on the bottom, I've already created an app catalog. An app catalog is where the apps exist for my organization. We'll click on App Catalog. And here it's going to show me all the different apps that I have. So here's my app requests. Here's my apps for SharePoint. It's a centralized place also for apps for Office. So that's where I can manage some of those things within my tenancy. Go back here. We'll show you one more thing. Apps, we want to also configure the store settings. So in this case here, let's say I have a tenant that I don't want my end users to download things from the marketplace. If there's an app that I want to make available, I'll download it as an administrator, upload it to the corporate store, and then make that available. Well, here I can go ahead and shut that off. I can go ahead and select no and say end users not available to select apps from the marketplace. And then what it'll do is it'll shut off those interfaces, so they'll lose that link, right? They won't be able to add things from the marketplace. So if you want to do that, there are some controls and some governance that is built into the apps. So those are the different examples, and that's the app catalog. We'll walk you through actually how to build them. Oh, and then monitoring. I'm sorry, I missed one thing. So monitoring. The other thing you can do is you don't want these apps kind of going crazy on your environment. The applications, and we'll talk through the architecture in a little bit. The application, the app, isn't really running on your farm. The app is actually running somewhere else. But since it is running client-side code, since it might be accessing some SharePoint APIs, you don't want a rogue app to really do something bad to your farm. And you want to actually be able to watch that. So here what they've done, and the SharePoint team has built a really good monitoring place where I could select, hey, I want to monitor some apps. And this particular app is a corporate news app. I want to maybe use some details on that particular app, review some errors. So from an IT pro standpoint, from a management standpoint, I do have some governance controls that are in here around these apps. So the app architecture, let's look at, we saw just examples of these apps. What are these apps actually made of? The big thing behind an app is going to be a manifest. That manifest is going to point to the start page of the app. And Nathan will show you examples of the start page of the app and how to configure that. But really what you're looking at is a place that SharePoint says, where do I go to actually run this particular application? Behind the scenes, the calls that are going to be interacting with SharePoint are all done through REST. They're done through events, remote event receivers, which are calls that go back and forth to SharePoint. You can also do BCS to interact with your SharePoint site. And here what we're showing is in the two columns, one is Windows IIS, Azure, or other, right? There's this completely other infrastructure that you can host and make calls back into SharePoint and actually get SharePoint data. So you still have that contextualness about the SharePoint site. You can still get access about the user, get access about what the user is looking at, get access to list data, things like that. The other thing that's interesting about the model is that there's a thing called the app web. And the app web is just this extra web that sits underneath your current web, or what's called the host web. And that app web can be used within your application. That's the only thing that's really getting, quote unquote, installed to SharePoint is this separate app web. And in that separate app web is where you can do things like store cache settings, store common settings that you don't want to maybe fetch over a high latency line, things like that. but when the app goes away, that app web is deleted, everything is removed from your app, and SharePoint has no idea that the app even existed, right? There's no, everything's hosted within that tiny little web within your SharePoint environment. And we'll show you, again, we'll show you examples of this coming up. Some of the benefits of that, well, we're not plugging into SharePoint. We're not deploying custom code. We're not dealing with those phone calls at midnight because a custom timer job ran off and grabbed a whole bunch of data and maybe it's pulling down my farm. Don't have to worry about that. The other thing that it does is it reduces the ramp-up time for developers. We'll show you in a second how to actually start that, like what does it take to actually build it. So if you're brand new to SharePoint and you've never built a SharePoint app, the on-ramp for actually building these as far as skill sets and tooling is very low. The thing around SharePoint skill sets is it was very difficult, right? If you've been around SharePoint for a while, it was, when you talked about webs, when we talked about sites versus site collections, that all kind of made sense. But if you're brand new to SharePoint, that stuff can be pretty intimidating. Now we're just looking at a regular JavaScript object model. We're just grabbing information out of CSOM and REST. And some of that's very natural to me as an HTML5 CSS developer. It also allows you to take SharePoint apps completely out of SharePoint and do the mashups that we've always been trying to do. Take information from an external system, plug it into SharePoint, use some SharePoint context data, and do something interesting with that information. So it allows us to really think outside the box for some of these things. Additional benefits that we've talked about here, low cost of entry for developers. You could build this in Notepad if you wanted to. You could build an app on Notepad if you understood the manifest and the JS file. You could build it on a Windows machine. You could also build it on a Mac. If you are going to be building these on a Mac, make sure that you do not use Safari, use Chrome or Firefox on the Mac. And you can use the Napa tools and actually build SharePoint apps on your Mac device. From an isolation standpoint, you're able to separate private clouds and public clouds. So if you actually have an Office 365 tenant, but you want to pull some information that's on-prem, maybe I don't want to move my data on-prem. So can you talk a little bit about some of the different scenarios there?
Yeah, so one of the things that, it's kind of a big confusion for a lot of my customers. One of the things that we talk about a lot is if you have line of business applications that are running and maybe they have some secure content behind them, you're not looking at having to port all of your database to some cloud solution. With this new app model in the provider hosted, one of the scenarios that we're going to show you is the servers can come from anywhere, and that means that those servers can come from on-premise as well. It doesn't even necessarily have to be published outside your network. The only thing that matters is that the browser has connectivity to your line of business app, so any web page that's hosting that up, as well as your Office 365 or your SharePoint solution. So basically, it's all client-side integration. So it really is a browser taking the application and the SharePoint UI and combining that and living that together. So when you're looking at building and testing out some of your applications, you can look at your Office 365 developer tenant and try to pull a report or pull a web page that you have today and see how that works in that model. And if you run like a fiddler against it, you'll see how the requests actually go out to both and how you can pass current context of the user of the SharePoint site. But you'll have all your content and your security from your application site coming directly from the browser to the site.
So how do I get started? How do I build apps? We'll show you a quick example of this. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to create an Office 365 tenant. You saw how to do that, dev.office.com. Click Start button. Go ahead and start your free trial unless you have an MSDN subscription. If you have an MSDN subscription, you get the developer tenant for free. If you already have an Office 365 tenant, go ahead and create what's called a developer site collection. When you create the developer site collection, you'll be able to see exactly what I'm going to show you in a minute. For simple SharePoint hosted client-side apps, you can use just regular HTML5 and JavaScript. And the Hello World app that comes with actually is going to show an example of that. We're going to leverage the Napa app to build this. For the server side, and again, we'll show you an example of the Napa app. Can you give us one sec? For the developer side, you can still do this in Visual Studio. You can actually take an application from Napa, download it to Visual Studio, and finish it there if you'd like. You could start it in Visual Studio. You could start it, you just download the project types, and you could start your SharePoint app right within Visual Studio. Or you can pick your technology of choice, leverage the APIs, and just talk to SharePoint, right? Talk to SharePoint, go figure out how to do the authentication. There are tons of examples on how to do that. There's actually one that we asked earlier about the SharePoint conference. There was a SharePoint conference talk that actually had a PHP site that was interacting with SharePoint. So it's completely non-Microsoft, talking to SharePoint. Go back. All right, so let's see what this looks like. What I have here is my developer tenant. On my developer tenant, I've got a big button. When you get this, it'll say Build Apps. When you click the button, it will be working on it. When you click the button, what it'll do is it'll launch an application called Napa. Now, Napa is an app. We called it at lunch the App Factory. It's an app that's built like an app that's used to build apps. It's an app that's built like an app used to build apps. All right, let's try this again.
I got nothing.
You got nothing. Oh, boy. Thank you, connectivity. All right, here we go. Can you take some questions?
Sure. Any questions so far? App world, new world, old world, Office, SharePoint, Office 365? No, nothing. I got. That's right. So if you're on premise, what's nice about this environment is if you've got a lot of developers, I would basically look at doing a site collection per developer. So have a developer site collection per developer. That way they can test and do things on their own developer site collection and manage that. Yep.
All right, so here I'm going to go ahead and click Add an App. So let me go back and show you what I did. Build an app. Go ahead and click on my developer tenant. You'll get this. It's not customized at all. This is what you get clearly out of the box. When you provision your developer tenant, it's going to launch this thing called the Napa Cloud App. This is the app that's an app that's used to build apps. I'm going to go ahead and click Add New Project. When I see this Add New Project, I'm going to get some information about different types of apps that I can build. This morning we talked about building Office apps. Today we're talking about building apps for SharePoint. So I go ahead and click App for SharePoint. I can give it a name. In this case, I will choose the interesting name, SharePoint App 4. And when we look at this, we kind of looks like just a regular web page, right? This is something we're used to. The thing that's interesting about this is I'm going to go to my app.js, and my app.js is actually going to be where I can get information from SharePoint. There's two things that are interesting about this. Here we have SP client context.getCurrent. What this does is it says, hey, I'm on a SharePoint site. Go get me the current SharePoint site that the app is running from, and go and get me the current user for that site. The other thing that's really cool about Napa is I get IntelliSense. Right? This is something I'm getting IntelliSense within a browser. I can grab information like get the login name from the user. I can get additional information like their user ID. These are all things, right? I'm getting full kind of interesting IntelliSense here. I can set the user's email, get their email address, things like that. And I can walk through this app. So it's kind of this, it's not a full-fledged environment, but it's a very good environment to actually get started. Here it's telling me that this particular function doesn't return anything. Here it tells me that, here it can highlight, and I can go through here. So it's pretty cool. Down here, let's do, we'll click this one here. This one's pretty interesting. So let's say I'm working on a project with my friends, and I wanted to share this. I can go ahead and share this project. So let's say I've built my SharePoint app, and I want to share it with somebody. What you'll get is this little short URL that's represented to this link. You can go ahead and send that link out to your friend. They install it into their developer tenant. Now they get access to your app. So it's a pretty quick way to actually share some of these applications. What they'll get on their side is a read-only copy of the app, but it's a quick way to kind of get some validation. Maybe you're working on something with some friends and you wanted to see, get some feedback. The other thing that's interesting is I can open this up in Visual Studio. So if I start my app here in Napa, I can click the button. What it does is it downloads a package to Visual Studio, launches Visual Studio, and I can actually run this. Nathan will show you an example of what it looks like in Visual Studio, so I'm not going to spend time on that one. What I will spend time on is pushing the button, and that button is the deployment button. Again, this is the hello world. I have done nothing to this application. There is nothing on my sleeve. You saw me do nothing except change a variable, so hopefully the variable that I changed, or the function that I changed, will not blow up my app. Let's go ahead and allow pop-ups. And there is what I was asking for. I was asking for the user's email address. There's my email address. So very quickly, you can go ahead and start building these applications. You get a kind of an integrated scripting environment. Click play, bam. I've got a SharePoint site. I've got a SharePoint application deployed. Now, we did that in 5 minutes because I spent time talking. For the SharePoint folks in the room.
Oh, and you had the browser issue too.
I had the browser issue too. So I mean, and probably, I don't know, a minute and a half, I've got a SharePoint app. I've got something that's running in SharePoint, right? I think it's pretty awesome. I don't think anyone else in the audience thinks it's awesome.
We'll move on.
We'll move on. Moving on.
External, like an external SharePoint list?
Repeat the question.
Oh, I see. Yes. BCS. So the question is, can I actually leverage BCS in a Napa solution? Correct? Yeah. I haven't tried BCS with Napa. I would assume you could because of the markup of it, but you can in the Visual Studio side. I don't know about the Napa side.
Yeah, the thing you can't do in Napa is you won't be able to create the assets. You won't be able to create the BCS model.
Yeah.
But Nathan's going to show you the tooling in Visual Studio. So in that case, but once it's deployed in your app, you should be able to get access to it, maybe? Call it?
That we don't know. We'll have to test it. Yep. Okay.
All right.
All right, so we're going to start talking about some of the different ways that we can host applications. When we look at application hosting, there really are two types of applications when you break it down. There's the SharePoint hosted application, which is what Israel showed in his first solution. This is where we actually build applications that are based on SharePoint artifacts. So it would be based on a list information or maybe a different UI on top of a search as part of an application. It could also be call-outs to third-party cloud services. And so we've got a weather application that we'll walk you through and do that as a SharePoint hosted app. So the idea is a SharePoint hosted, it's really the only kind of app that actually lives on SharePoint. But there's no native code. There's no Java, there's no .NET, or there's no PHP type of solution on there. The other two types of applications are really identical for the most part. And so that's the auto-hosted app. Has anyone heard of an auto-hosted app before? Okay. So an auto-hosted app is basically a provider-hosted app, but it's geared for Office 365. So if, for example, you don't have an Azure tenant, and this is something that you guys can all do with your developer tenant that you're going to go home and provision and work with your kids and spouse on building an app on. But what an auto-hosted app does is it allows you to do .NET databases and ship all of that as one package solution to your Office 365 tenant. And it's basically credited based on an Office 365 tenant. But it's identical to the provider-hosted as far as what you can do from a .NET side. And then finally, the provider-hosted is really the bring-your-own infrastructure. So that can be, when we're from Microsoft, we say that is an Azure solution. But obviously, it can be an on-premise solution. So if you've got servers, if you have legacy applications that are running, really provider-hosted model is what you're looking at in that case. So basically, the SharePoint app, so the SharePoint host web is what's running the app. The app web is what's actually that part that Israel showed, where it basically has the SharePoint artifacts. And the web parts or the redirection into the provider-hosted or auto-hosted application, which hosts the .NET side of the code. On the applications, again, the site itself is actually hosted on your premise or in Azure or Amazon or wherever you want to host it. It's just not hosted in SharePoint is what it comes down to. So kind of some differences of those different models. So in a SharePoint hosted model, it's basically the app scope of that is a SharePoint site. So if I have it installed on a SharePoint site, I install it on another SharePoint site, it's going to have a different set of lists, different set of cache data. So it is a per site-based scope. Whereas a cloud hosted can actually be at a site level, but it also can be for the whole tenant. And so one of the sessions that we're doing, we're building a multi-tenant application in Azure that we're doing on Thursday, and we're kind of walking through how to provision for multi-tenants in customer sets and whatnot. So it's really up to you as far as how your application handles that, how it provisions multiple databases, or how it registers the different tenants on there. Architecture-wise, it's basically SharePoint host, it's a website. The cloud hosted, it actually can be really a set of websites or a set of services. It really is up to you. Developer skill sets, again, if we look at SharePoint hosted, we're really talking about HTML, JavaScript, and SharePoint. Cloud hosted, we're talking about really whatever you want to bring to the web, you can bring to the table. Limitation-wise, we're looking at really no server code on SharePoint hosted. We talked about that. I'll show you what that looks like in a solution as well. And then from a cloud hosted side, it really is whatever language you decide to go to. And then for what's it good for? The SharePoint hosted, hopefully in the demos that we're going to show you, you get a good idea for when you might leverage a SharePoint hosted versus an auto hosted versus kind of provider hosted. But basically SharePoint hosted, we kind of look at it as maybe smaller applications. We've got a demo for weather. We've got poll survey demo types of things. So those might be good candidates for a SharePoint hosted where you're managing data within a SharePoint list, but you really don't care about if that goes away long term, whether you install it or install it into multiple locations. Cloud hosted is much more for scenarios where you might have long-term databases log in the back end, or you might have, regardless of where that app's installing at, it's actually going to call everything in the back-end system. So a couple things on the SharePoint host. Again, we talked about this, but we'll jump into kind of demo to illustrate this. But basically, the SharePoint host lives in the application and the SharePoint. The callbacks to SharePoint are using CSOM and REST APIs, and we'll show you what that looks like. So client-side object model to make JavaScript calls back into SharePoint, or REST API calls, whichever you prefer on that. We use client-side web parts, we use app pages, and we use SharePoint lists for the logic, or for the storage. Business logic, HTML5 and JavaScript, and then developer skill sets obviously is jQuery, HTML5, CSS, and then CSOM and REST from the SharePoint callbacks. So one more thing that I want to point out, when we're running this in the demonstration, you'll notice that the app URL, is actually, when you break that down, it actually has the app site, it has a unique ID for the application, and it has .sharepoint.com, or if you're on premise, it's going to have whatever your domain is. And then it actually has the app title itself. So you're in control of the app title, you're not in control of the app ID. So that's one thing to be aware of. So that's why in the application, we do get current context, which is the app web. If we want to call out outside of SharePoint, we'll talk about that's where permissions come in, where we need to request permissions. So the application, it's self-contained, it's isolated, and we can have full control over lists or pages within that application web itself. But as soon as we remove that application, everything goes away. So the first demonstration I'm going to walk you through is a SharePoint hosted application. This is actually a weather application. So this is a weather application. This is actually my tenant here. A couple things to note. I can go out here into this weather application. This actually makes a call out into a weather service, and I didn't want to actually have a call out every time. I'm cheap, and I have a free weather service that gives me so many calls to it. So what I wanted to do is actually cache those calls. So what I'm using is a SharePoint list. I make the call out to the weather site, and then I actually write that data to a SharePoint list. Every subsequent call to that, if it's within a 10-minute interval, I'll actually read it from my SharePoint list and display it on this web part or this page. And then I actually refresh it after a 10-minute interval is over. So one thing to note is I've got my ID because it generated that ID. I've got my tenant at the start of that. And then I have weather, which is the name of my application in there as well. But the other thing to note is obviously this doesn't make sense as a page. It's not a very attractive page. So what we can do is we can also test web parts on here. So the one thing I do recommend learning from experience is when you're testing web parts, don't put them on your main page because you might have web parts that don't function the way you want to, and you can't get to the main page then. So what I always do is I always create a test web part page in my developer tenant. It's always the first thing I do. So I avoid the temptation of dropping web parts that break my whole main page on there. So anyway, so what we've got in here is if I go into the page edit, I can also go into edit the page and then insert either an app part. You'll find it here, my weather web part. I've got title. I didn't change the title. We also put them in the web parts. So for right now, we're actually putting them in both locations. But I do recommend start getting people used to using the app parts for applications, just because obviously it's intended for this type of purpose. So I'll go ahead and drop this app on the page. So again, it's just a web part that's actually calling into that same app web. Same context of the app web. It knows the app web when I get current context, and then I can actually just drag and drop and put that web part anywhere on the page. It's a client-side web part, so it's all JavaScript behind the scenes. But anyway, we'll jump into the code. So here's my SharePoint project. And so one thing that you're going to notice is you'll see the little SharePoint slide. You'll notice that this just has a SharePoint project to it. We can add, if we wanted to add .NET code, it would become an auto-hosted or it would become a provider-hosted and would have 2 projects associated to it. And the one thing that's nice about the auto-hosted, provider-hosted is all of them have a SharePoint part to it. So whether you're SharePoint provider or you're auto-hosted or provider-hosted, all of them have this part of it. So one thing to note is when I go into my part, I've got a web part. So my web part is just simply calls out to my app web, calls out to a page, provisions a web WP ASPX page, and it passes the standard tokens. This is actually what we use to get the context of the current site, current user, and make the callbacks in using the OAuth authentication. So in the application itself, when the application starts, we actually make a call to retrieve weather in this case. So what I do is I actually call to get the weather cached. I'm going to assume that it's cached. If it's not, I'll actually make the call outs to the weather service. Oh, yep. So in the weather service, no, that's not where I want to go. In the weather service, I have retrieve weather cache. So this guy here is going to look familiar. So this is actually using our CSOM model. So you see the sp.clientContext.getCurrent. This is what Israel showed. But underneath that, you've got client context, getWeb.getList, get title by title. And I'm actually calling that weather cache list. So it's very easy to actually pass it a query. In this case, I'm actually using a camel query to query the data on that. I could also use REST too if I wanted to actually query that list by REST and actually go through it the REST way. What I end up doing in this case is I actually get the list, and then I actually call, if I successfully got the list, I call and loop through and get my weather cached out of that. So within here then, you'll see that I'm actually making the call out to that list. So basically all I do is I get the enumerator, I move to it, and then I start getting the list items from the different columns in that list, and I set a weather object to that. And then I use that weather object to display the different weather on there. So it's very easy to actually get information from SharePoint, as well as whether I got that information from the weather service or from SharePoint. I've got a common form factor that I'm just passing to a display template and just displaying it. And you'll see down at the bottom, then I've got my weather cache, where I check the cache age. And then if it's older than 10 minutes, I go ahead and delete that cache. I'm using CSOM. I delete the item in the list, and then I just rewrite it next time I make the call. And then on display weather, here's my ID. So here's the Weather Underground that I'm calling. I'm just calling their API. They have a JSON API. They also have an XML API for that. So what I do is I just make the call to their service. I'm just doing an AJAX call. You've got the URL. I'm using, just notice the data type JSON-P. And then once I get the return, I'm actually just parsing that and putting it into that same weather object that I've got on my JavaScript. And then once I actually return that, I just call display weather. And then I use display weather just to write out the template. So you notice on display weather, it's just writing it out. So you notice that here's where, if you think about weather, stock tickers, polls where I'm actually surveying people within the organization, very quick hit types of web parts. Also, very quick for setting up things that we can actually just put a different UI on. And so that's where these SharePoint solutions come in really handy for that. And again, these can be combined with the other solutions, but just kind of wanted to show what types of things you would actually put in the SharePoint land, and then also what that might look like from a calling into SharePoint and calling into remote services as well. And just to show kind of the write cache. So again, the context for writing the item, I just do a list.add, and then I set my item columns in the list.add. And then, of course, delete, it's the same thing. And out on MSDN, there's actually all the operations for lists, for websites, and they actually have sample code for C# and for JavaScript for each one. So you can actually take the different templates for interacting with lists or websites or people search and actually have good examples for each type of snippet so you can get started very quickly on this stuff. I guess one other thing to note is I'll go ahead and run this into the debugger too. So I'll go ahead and set a breakpoint here. I'll hit start. And so from a Visual Studio standpoint, you'll see that I'm retracting the solution. I'll go ahead and load that up into SharePoint, and then it will attach the debugger to it, and I can actually debug JavaScript perfectly fine, and it helps me walk through what the surfaces are returning. So notice that it's fairly quickly to actually install the SharePoint slide and make the call back into my project. And then I've got my breakpoint, and then it's just the same type of Visual Studio solution where I'm actually stepping through the JavaScript to make the calls, make the execute queries. Put this right down here. And then it's running. And then on retrieve of that, it saw that I successfully retrieved it. It needs to go out there and get the weather because it's bad. Anyway, it runs and it will actually run that web part that you saw earlier. And actually, that's it. So it's 90 degrees. If anyone's from Texas like me, it's 90 degrees in Irving right now.
And if you're not from Texas, it's 90 degrees in Texas.
That's right. Then you still care.
Now you know.
All right, so that's kind of our first application, the SharePoint hosted app. So when we looked at the application, there really are kind of three types of UI elements that you got to think about. Really, the first two are the most probably popular ones. So the first one is the full app page. So you saw when I went into the web part, or when I launched the app, it actually goes into full page. That's kind of the default mode, is every app will actually go into a hosted website that's either hosted in SharePoint or hosted on Azure or hosted on your own servers. The next part is actually the web part. So the app web that we saw, the client-side web part, that's that next type of scenario. And then finally, the final scenario is an application extension or a custom action. So the custom actions work largely the way they did in SharePoint 2010, where basically we have an action, we launch it, and it actually launches to a full page or launches to another page on your websites. But it can be used in lists or into kind of business process type standpoints. So a couple of things that you note on branding. I'll show you a couple of other applications where we made different branding decisions on it. The application that we saw on the weather, it actually takes the SharePoint designs on. So you have to make a conscious choice of where are my users coming into the site, and how do I want those web parts, or how do I want that look and feel to be? Do I want it to look like it's part of the SharePoint site, or do I want it to look like something of its own brand? So those are kind of different types of things that you need to think about. The other thing that you need to think about is the Chrome on the control as well. It's called Chrome Control. And so when you notice that full page launch that we had, if you want to have the out-of-box look and feel of the SharePoint menu, that's the Chrome Control. And it's basically a div tag plus some JavaScript that actually injects that Chrome Control into your application. So it's what I call putting lipstick on a pig. If you have a legacy application, you can actually make the legacy application look like it's running in SharePoint. So it's a very quick way to take legacy web applications, surface them up with the Chrome Control or with the SharePoint styles, and have that look like it's part of your site, whether it's a web part or whether it's a full application. And I'm seeing that being a very attractive thing for a lot of my customers to get their solutions kind of finally all on one platform. So we talked about the Chrome Control, but here's kind of the call out to the Chrome Control. This is how it works. Is basically we've got a JavaScript library that has a style sheet in it, and we retrieve that from the SharePoint site. So what we do is when you actually call your application, it calls into that JavaScript library and actually pulls the current styles and current Chrome Control and injects it into that div tag that's actually in your application. That's how we actually make that hook work. You can also use scripts to actually put in your own settings and custom nav inside that Chrome Control as well. So the next thing we're going to talk about is application and the SharePoint communication that happens. So in the applications themselves, obviously they're all going to be running outside of SharePoint. So we're going to have to use REST and CSOM to make those calls back into SharePoint. So we saw a little bit of the CSOM on the JavaScript side, but we'll show you how that works in .NET applications and .NET applications that might be running in Azure or running on-premise for your servers. So the other thing that's important to note, and we'll actually show what this looks like, is the granted permission for the applications themselves. So when we talk about SharePoint, and you notice that those calls that I made to that list, I could do inserts, deletes, updates. I didn't have to request any permission for that. And the reason why is because it's in the SharePoint app web. I installed the list. It was part of my solution. When I remove my solution, that list gets removed. But if I make a call to a SharePoint list outside of my solution, say the SharePoint host, or I make a call to search or profiles, I need to request permission for that. And it has to be granted to me for my application to run. And so basically, when we request permissions, when that app gets installed, that Israel showed that trust, it's an all or nothing. You can't pick which permissions that you want when you install the application into a site. So a couple of different choices that you have on the callbacks into SharePoint. So your application's running, it's running on Azure, it's running in your sites. We have the client-side object model for managed code. So this is basically a set of C# libraries that have callbacks into SharePoint. So it gets current context, and we can load up and call any APIs that we would in the server-side model. So if you've done any SharePoint code, server-side code before, this should look very familiar to you. There's basically, in the setup, there's a little bit difference, but basically we mirrored kind of APIs for the different DLLs. So if you're used to the server-side DLLs, just switch it to the .client DLL, and it should be a very close match to the different calls. The next thing we showed you is the CSOM module for JavaScript. This is actually, if I'm just in the JavaScript side, I can actually use this model. And then finally, we've got the REST model. So if I'm basically everything in SharePoint, to make this model work for us, we had to expose every list, every service as REST enabled as well. This allows us to make calls from REST and actually return that through regular REST APIs for any of the SharePoint data. So here's what those different API calls look like, just to kind of put it all in one context. So if I make a REST call or an OData call, in this case, I'm actually making a call to get the web title. And so you see contosa.sharepoint.com _API. The underscore API is basically a handler that we put in front of the server-side APIs that basically redirects all the traffic to the client-side model. So if you're concerned about if there's missing documentation for some of the server-side calls, all you have to do is look at or client-side calls, all you have to do is look at the server-side calls. The APIs and documentation match. But it's basically the underscore API is that handler that redirects everything. The next model is that managed code model. So if we establish context and we actually have the load context, it's the same call. It's that web.title. And then when we have to do the execute query, that's what populates those the different context calls that we make. And then finally, the JavaScript model, very similar to the managed code model. So we're establishing it. We're doing the get underscore web, get underscore title. So the pattern there is if there's a property, you have to do the get underscore or the set underscore for that managed property to set or get that value. And then we use the execute query asynchronous to actually populate it. All right, so app permissions. When we look at the app permissions that our SharePoint app's going to do, these are basically permissions that we do on the app manifest. And I'll walk you through with the app manifest and setting those different permissions. But these are actually set during installation. And they must be granted by the user that's executing the app. So basically, when the app gets installed, that user can't be executing permissions beyond what their normal permissions are. So it's the user plus the application are what's granted into the executing of any kind of calls. We can't basically have a user install an app that's beyond their permission reach, is basically what it means. An admin would have to install it and grant it to that user to access that permissions. So one thing to note is if you're using a hybrid farm configuration or you're using Office 365, when we do the application installs or the application permission granting, it's actually Azure ACS that's actually doing the application ID plus the different permission grants for the applications. That's whether it's on an Azure, whether it's on a hybrid farm where you're actually trusting that the store to add applications, or whether it's using Office 365. If you're doing it on-premise, it's a little different. You're actually doing a server-to-server trust, and we call that a high-trust application, or S2S. So it's a little different call to make that exchange, but basically the concepts in the code's the same outside of that one call. So here's the app manifest, what it looks like. And so you notice that in here we've got, you can edit it through the XML, but now we put a nice UI on top of that where we can actually do the app granting. And I'll actually show you this in our application. But basically, we've got the permissions, we've got the general settings for that application. But the manifest is really kind of where the magic happens for tying everything together on the applications. And once we actually pass the application, Israel mentioned this before, but it's much like a Facebook application where we actually make different Facebook permissions. We'll do a trust, so we do the grants of the different permission. In this case, we've got a web, a user profile read, and we've got a tenant. And then when we actually install that, we'll actually see the application, the trust on that application that it announces that to the installer or to the admin on what level it's going to query on that application on that SharePoint site.
Now, quick question here, Nathan. Does this happen for every time this application is running?
No, this happens only on initial install, whether it's installed to the app catalog or installed into a given site is when this actually gets prompted. So on the security and context, we actually kind of showed this, but basically when you look at the context of the user, the token helper from the managed code side is really what ends up passing that OAuth credential. We ship the token helper with any .NET class or any .NET project that you do. So if I do an application and I want to do .NET code, the token helper is what's critical to make that application have the callbacks into SharePoint. If you're not having to call back into SharePoint, then it really doesn't matter a whole lot. But the token helper is really what establishes that context and allows you to do the callbacks into SharePoint. In this case, what we do is we do the get current context to establish that, and then we have to do the client context .load and then the execute query to get the different loaded objects that we're querying for. So one other thing that we've got is the cross-domain calls. We're not going to go into a whole lot of detail on this, but basically I just want to make you aware of this. So if you're in the JavaScript side and you need to make a cross-domain call, so for example, if I've got an application that's living in Azure or living on a server on IIS on-premise, and I want to make a call into SharePoint, we use what's called SP Request Executor JavaScript library. And there's some examples of this. We'll show you what it looks like, but there's some good examples of how you actually query list information from a remote JavaScript library. It's not using anything SharePoint specific. We actually took an industry pattern and just wrapped it into a library. So here's kind of the call for that. So basically, we use underscore API, and you'll notice that the SP app context, the app context site, the target site, and then actually the property that we're going after for that call. All right, so now we're going to look at provider-hosted and auto-hosted applications. So the first application that we'll look at is an application that a colleague of mine wrote called Kudos. And so Kudos, basically the concept of that is that we will grant basically kudos for people that do something good in my organization. So you notice that we did a couple tie-ins. First off, we did a tie-in to the user profile service. So if we wanted to say, we wanted to look up a person in there and actually assign them a badge because they did something good. We also wanted to add that to the social feed. So we had to make a permission to the social feed to actually write that to the wall for their feed in SharePoint. So here's a link down here where I've got the Kudos application. And so I'll go ahead and click on that, launch that application. And we've got a couple things on the SharePoint side in this. Let me go into the badges. So we've got a manage badges. This is actually a manage badges list where we can actually control different badges and different logos for the badges and the types of things that people can assign out in the list. And so what we also have is we keep a collection of kudos that I might have sent over the last month or all time. We also have ones that I've received in here. So a couple things that we do. So if I start typing a name, we have basically a remote people picker where we can actually do REST queries and actually pull in information from people in here. And so I'll go ahead and grant this to Garrett. And then what kind of badge do I want to give him? So I can actually pick which kind we'll pick a community hero. So we can give him a badge and maybe say something nice about what he did for one of the projects. So that grants a badge. This is all running in a .NET code. So there's .NET code. There's actually a database on the back of this. This sample's out actually on Richard's blog as well, so you can actually download this and install it into your environment or install it into your dev tent that you've got. This one's actually set up as an auto-hosted app, and I'll kind of walk you through what ends up happening when it packages and deploys that. But anyway, you notice that it got written here, and then also when I go to my my site, it's actually that feed that I gave him a badge is actually written to my site as well. So let's go into application. So you'll notice that there's a couple different things on this type of application versus the other application that we wrote earlier. So first off that you'll notice is we've got the SharePoint host. So again, we still have that same concept. Everything that I wrote in the last application, I can actually do in this application as well. Log in. It misses me. I need to tell it. Remember me, but it never does. Okay, so I've got the SharePoint site. I actually have the SharePoint, everything I did in the last application I can do here. So I've got my web parts, I've got my badges from the list, but now I actually have a .NET solution that's associated to this as well. So if you look down on the .NET side, I actually have a full .NET, ASP.NET solution that I can run. So everything I can do in .NET, I can do in here, which is kind of nice. So if I look at a couple things here, the token helper gets shipped with your solution if it's auto-hosted or provider-hosted. You get that automatically. I don't recommend, from a best practice standpoint, if you're going to make changes because you want token helper to pull in something extra, I don't recommend making changes to the token helper itself. I recommend either doing extensions or doing a utility helper with that. And the reason why is because a lot of times I'll inherit code, and I make the assumption that token helper is always the same. And it might not be. It might actually behave a different way. I never think to debug the token helper because I assume people aren't going to change it. We ship this with it, so like I said, you can make changes to it, but I recommend as kind of a best practice, do a utility class or do an extension method on the token helper. The other thing to note in here is we talked about the app manifest. So in this case, what we see is we've got the control of the solution name, we've got the title, we have the query string that when it gets executed, it's going to execute this default page, it's going to pass standard tokens, and it's also going to pass the different host title as well as the logo and display type if we want to do full screen or if we want to do a web part display of this. And then we also have the hosting type. So is it auto-hosted, is it provider-hosted, or is it a SharePoint-hosted site? Again, what we also have is permissions. So if I'm making calls out to the user profile service, that's a permission I need to make. Otherwise, those calls are going to fail when I make that call happen. We also have a tenant right in this case because we're actually having to write something at the tenant level in here. I don't recommend go with least base privilege permission every time. So don't try to escalate to a tenant right because you're going to have an admin install that if you need to do something like that. And then we also have core social because we just needed some social capabilities for lookups and whatnot in the site. If we actually went in here and viewed it in code, you would see it's just XML. So I could actually cut and paste those permissions in XML. The UI would reflect that as well. So other thing that's interesting on here is this is an auto-hosted app. So what that means is I actually have a database project associated with this. I also have a web project associated with this, so my .NET web project. And when I do an auto-hosted, it actually packages up my database, it packages up my web app, and ships it all for me and auto-hosts it in Office 365 or Office 365 and Azure automatically. I don't have to do anything or know about the infrastructure to do that. I could do web WCF services, I could do .NET, I could do SQL, Azure, all that stuff just works and bundles it. So just to kind of show that solution, so if I go in here and I say publish, notice that it's an auto-hosted app. I'll go ahead and hit finish. This is actually packaging up the app. It actually packages up my website, packages up my database, and then I can take that app file, that solution that Israel showed for the app catalog, I can take the app file and move it to the app catalog, and that will auto-deploy my database as well as my website and my SharePoint host site. So here's the app file. And if I go in here and actually change this to .zip, I could go ahead and open this guy up. And you'll see inside here that, again, I've got my full, that web.zip is actually my full web.net website that's actually getting shipped out and deployed whenever this app gets added to the app catalog and installed. The other thing that you'll notice in here is there's a .WSP. We didn't go away from WSPs. They're actually shipped inside the .app packages, and I got all the SharePoint side of the house. So any lists, any site columns are actually in that .WSP file and shipped with it as well. And then you'll notice that we've got a .DAC pack. So that's my SQL database. So if I ship it with data or I ship it with that whole database, it gets zipped up as a DAC pack and actually shipped out and hosted as soon as I do the install for my website. Okay. And so the last one that I'm going to show you the difference is I'll also show you on, let me go back into my site. Interest of time, I'll actually just show this to you real quick. This actually, we're doing a deep dive on this one though later in the week if you want to see more about the Azure side and how we do kind of the hosting. Here's kind of this help desk app that we did. This is actually running on the mod down on the floor as well. But if we go into the help desk demo, this is actually a provider hosted. So this is actually hosting in our own Azure instance. So in this case, we didn't want to have auto-hosted. We actually wanted more control over our Azure websites. So an auto-hosted is basically, think about it as a small Azure website. In this case, we wanted to have control where we're actually hosting it in our own Azure instance, and we have maybe other web sites associated to that. So you notice here, the other thing that we did is on the branding decision, we decided to kind of take on our own brand. So the only thing that we needed was kind of the go back to our website as part of our application. So we've got a lot more in this application, but I'll actually just jump through, so we're making calls to search, we're making calls to analytics, to our database, we're actually making calls to people search. So we'll go into more details later, but I just want to show you how the publishing works of a auto-hosted versus something like this that's a provider-hosted application. So in this application, what we end up doing is the code looks identical, whether it's auto-hosted or provider-hosted. And one of the things I recommend is if you're getting started in building your first .NET SharePoint app, I recommend maybe starting with auto-hosted in the developer tenant. It's a good way to go, and you could always switch it over if you want to or had to. But in this case, what we do, the main thing that changes, debugging is the same, development's the same. When you actually change deployments, what's different? So in a provider-hosted, when I actually do deployment, I can actually do publish. I have to publish my website. So in this case, I'm actually going to an Azure website. So you see that I've got a website deployment in here. In Azure, you can go out and set up a website and actually download the website publishings. It's just a download, and it pre-fills all these out. And all you have to do is actually set this up as a publishing profile, import it, and it actually has the full setup for you. All you have to do is actually say next and publish it. It refreshes my Azure website. And if I want to basically update the database, I can. If the data is good and I just had to make a patch to the website, I can do that, and it takes a few seconds to refresh it, and I'll have the new site out there without me having to reinstall anything in SharePoint, because it's basically calling out to my Azure site for all that. On the SharePoint site, I still have my SharePoint host as well, which of course is going to ask me for logging into SharePoint.
I miss you, Nathan.
I miss you.
Tell me who you are.
You haven't called. You haven't looked. I won't even bother saying keep me. Okay, so if I look on the SharePoint side, again, SharePoint solution stuff, web parts list, event receivers, app event receivers, all go on this side. All of those events, all of the code that it's calling into goes in my .NET side that's being hosted in Azure. So this is kind of how the model works. This is the provider-hosted solution. And then in this case, I'd go ahead and hit publishing. So I'd publish this. And then here, I'd actually say I want to publish this for my dev publishing. And this is one that I configured out here. So what website am I going to in Azure? And then the OAuth key. So what's the client ID and what's the secret that I need to publish? When you're developing these solutions, it will replace that client ID and secret. Don't let that fool you. That's not what you're wanting to take to production. What you want to take to production is a client ID and secret in your website that you generate either in the app registration or you pick one of the client IDs and websites or client IDs and secrets that you're going to use. And save that off. So every time you're going to publish to a unique Azure site, that's a client ID and secret that you want to use each time on the SharePoint app registration, as well as on the Azure website. That's what makes that OAuth and context happen. That's how the magic happens. Okay.
All right, so we'll go back. So we have provider hosted, SharePoint hosted, auto hosted. So here we're just going to talk about the different scenarios about how I decide between an auto hosted and a provider hosted app in relationship to tenancy. The thing you have to think about with your apps is if you have any one of these models, I'm going to be installed in multiple SharePoint sites. So what does that look like when I actually run it? Me as the developer, I'm going to go ahead and deploy the app to my infrastructure. So just as Nathan showed, he deploys the app to his infrastructure, and now it goes up there. Again, that infrastructure could be anything. He chose Windows Azure, could be any one of these other solutions. I've deployed my app, and I've made it available to the store. Tenant admin, I give him my .app file. He goes ahead and uploads it. He uploads it to the app catalog, which we actually showed you in the beginning. Site owner then opens up that app catalog, installs the application. What happens on the back end for that site owner is that they get a website and an app database. Well, if another site owner comes along, they're going to get another website and another database. In some cases, this is actually fine, right? If we look at the example where Nathan showed the weather application might be okay. You just stand it up, you call some services. These caches don't really need to synchronize or anything. They're just making calls. Everything's okay. But in the example for the help desk, well, we might want to do something different. Let's say, for example, I also make this app available on the store. Tenant B now picks it up. Now this is outside of my organization. I make it available to my store. Tenant B now gets that. Well, guess what? They get their own website, their own app database. Might be okay, might not be okay, depending on the tenancy point of view. But the thing that you also have to think about is, well, what if I want to share some information across these tenants? What if I want to manage the tenancy of those individuals and maybe I want to manage licenses, maybe I want to manage some additional information. In the case of the help desk app, maybe that's being installed in multiple site collections, multiple tenants. I need to manage that. Well, the thing I can do there is I can then manage that on the back end. That's where I would go to a more of a provider-hosted type model where I'm going to bring my own infrastructure, I'm going to bring my own database, and that's going to help me. I'm going to go ahead and manage my own tenancy within my application. So this is kind of a quick how you decide between provider-hosted and self-hosted or Azure auto-hosted. All right, so what we originally started off with was to give you an introduction into the app model. We also wanted to talk to you about the different hosting options, how you decide between where I put my application. Wanted to give you a quick overview on how to actually develop these solutions, what are the different tools that I have available to me. A quick overview on permissions and security to know that there. There are deeper dives on all of these topics in different sessions. I think actually here we'll show you related content. We do have some additional information here. Building an auto-hosted app, there's some hands-on labs where you can actually get your hands dirty if you want to take a look at this a little bit deeper.
Yeah, and I do recommend on the, no problem. On the labs themselves, I do recommend going out there and just trying it. Do a SharePoint hosted or do an auto hosted. Also, if, after this week, I would say that the Ignite material that's out on MSDN is really good. So I would definitely recommend going out there and kind of checking out the different modules. They have, I think it's like 8 or 10 hands-on labs for each one. But once you go out there and kind of do it, you'll start seeing where this model might fit in. And I know that when we first went through the Ignite, we saw the changes and whatnot, and it was kind of interesting.
Yeah.
I actually thought, I'm done. This is it. I'm done as a developer. I'll go be a DBA or something else. But more we work in this model, it actually is really rewarding because you start seeing a lot more return on the debugging, on the development. You can do things a lot faster than what you could have in the old model, even for a development and deployment standpoint.
Absolutely. All right, there's some additional resources there. Make sure you fill out your evals. I think the correct answer is the one that's the best. Whether it's a 1 or a 5, you want to make sure it is the 5. If you do feel that you have some feedback, just go ahead and please add notes. We do take it serious.
Yeah, and we are personally sending anyone that gives us good reviews. We're personally sending one of those choices for each one.
Exactly. They're getting a developer tenant. Actually, everybody gets a developer tenant.
Not that stuff. A developer tenant we're giving you. Sorry. Mistake.
All right, we're going to stick around for questions. We have a little bit of time left. We want to definitely appreciate you. Thank you for your time, and please enjoy TechEd.